The baby's cry had become a sound that everyone knew but no one listened to. It echoed softly through the narrow street every evening, weaving between the walls of old houses and flickering streetlights. Some said they had gotten used to it, that it didn't mean much anymore. Others said the mother was probably just busy, or that maybe the baby cried too easily. Either way, people stopped paying attention. At the end of Willow Street stood a small apartment building with cracked paint and a metal gate that squeaked whenever someone pushed it open. Behind one of those rust-colored doors, the baby lived. No one in the building really knew the family that well. They had moved in a few months earlier, a young woman and her newborn. She kept mostly to herself. She didn't talk to the neighbors, didn't greet anyone in the hallways, and rarely stayed home for long. At first, when people heard the baby crying late at night, they felt sorry. One woman from the second floor even knocked on the door once, offering some leftover baby food she had. The mother thanked her but didn't open the door fully. After that, nobody tried again. The days turned into weeks and the crying never stopped. It came at odd hours, sometimes early morning, sometimes late at night when the whole building was quiet. The neighbors grew tired of it. They whispered about the mother, that she looked too thin, that she seemed lost, that she was always in a hurry. A few thought about calling someone for help, but no one did. People always had reasons. Maybe it's not that bad, or someone else will do it, or I don't want to get involved. And so, the baby's tiny voice was drowned by the noise of daily life. The woman in the apartment next door would turn up her TV volume when the crying got louder. The man downstairs would close his window and mutter about how kids these days never stop crying. The people who passed by on the street below might look up once, shake their heads, and keep walking. The baby cried on and the world kept moving as if it didn't hear. No one really knew what was going on inside that apartment. The curtains were always drawn. Sometimes the lights would flicker late into the night, and other times it stayed dark for hours. A few times neighbors thought they saw the mother leaving, always in a hurry, clutching her bag tightly. They noticed how her steps were quick, like she was running from something. But by morning, the crying would return again. There was a strange sadness that hung around that building. Not something people spoke about, but something that could be felt. It was in the air, in the silence that came after the baby's voice finally grew tired. People told themselves the mother probably knew what she was doing. They said she's probably struggling, but it's not our business. They said babies cry all the time, that's normal. The truth was no one wanted to know. Knowing meant caring, and caring meant doing something. And doing something meant stepping out of comfort, something few were willing to do. In the middle of this quiet ignorance, life went on as usual. The market on the corner still opened every morning. Kids still played on the cracked sidewalk. Neighbors still gossiped about everything except the sound of that baby. One day the crying went on for so long that even the delivery boy who dropped off mail stopped at the door. He paused, listened, then sighed and kept walking. He told himself maybe the mother was inside taking a nap or cooking. It wasn't his job to interfere. Inside that small apartment, time seemed to move differently. The air was heavy and the tiny space smelled faintly of baby powder and cold air. A crib stood near the window with a thin blanket tucked around a little body. The baby's cheeks were wet from tears, his fists curled tight. He didn't understand why no one came when he cried. Sometimes the mother would come home. She would feed him, hold him close, whisper something under her breath, and then disappear again. There were moments when her eyes were full of something deep, maybe guilt, maybe exhaustion. She wasn't cruel. She was lost. The weight of her life had become too heavy, and she didn't know how to ask for help. Outside, people noticed how thin she had become. Her hair was always messy, her clothes wrinkled. Some said she looked too young to be a mother. Others said she looked like someone who'd given up. But no one said those things to her face. Even when she passed by them in the hallway carrying grocery bags with shaking hands, no one stopped to ask if she was okay. They simply nodded politely or looked away, and so the apartment stayed silent except for the crying, that same heartbreaking sound that filled the nights and faded into mornings. Winter came, and the cold winds made everything worse. The baby's cries became softer, weaker. Some nights the neighbors thought maybe the baby had finally stopped crying for good, and they felt relief. But deep down there was a guilt they couldn't quite name, because ignoring something doesn't make it go away. It just makes you used to it. A few people in the building started to joke about it. That poor kid has a strong set of lungs, someone said. Another replied, yeah, maybe the mom should get him some toys. They laughed, not out of cruelty, but because laughing made them feel less responsible. The world around that apartment seemed to move faster than ever. People chasing buses, hurrying to work, scrolling through phones. Everyone was busy. No one had time to notice the small, tired baby behind that curtain. And yet, there was always that sound. Faint, steady, asking for something. It wasn't just hunger or discomfort. It was loneliness, the kind that even babies can feel. There were moments late at night when the mother would sit on the floor near the crib and stare at the baby with tired eyes. She would whisper, "I'm sorry," over and over. Maybe she meant sorry for not being enough, sorry for being alone, sorry for everything she couldn't change. But her apologies were silent prayers that no one else could hear. She had no family nearby. Her phone was filled with unanswered messages. The bills on the table kept piling up. Every knock on the door made her jump. The world outside felt cold and unforgiving, and the only warmth she had was that tiny baby, the one who kept crying for love she didn't know how to give. And outside, the neighborhood slept. Cars passed. Dogs barked. Lights turned off one by one. In that darkness, one small sound carried through the air, soft, tired, and full of need. It drifted past the old trees, over fences, into the hearts of those who pretended not to hear. The baby everyone ignored kept crying. He didn't know that people heard him. He didn't know that they chose silence instead. He just kept doing the only thing he could, crying into a world that had decided not to care. Sometimes, the universe seems to hold its breath before something changes. That was what this moment felt like, a long, quiet pause before a story begins to shift. But for now, the baby cried, and the world stayed still. The sound of tiny heartbreaks filled the empty night air. No one came, not yet. The sound of the crying baby reached more ears than people wanted to admit. It was like a soft echo that refused to fade, a reminder of something no one wanted to face. One afternoon, a young girl walked past that street for the first time. She was part of a small volunteer group that helped at the community center a few blocks away. The center provided food, books, and after-school activities for kids. She often walked the same route every day, passing the same shops, the same people, the same tired buildings. But that day something changed. The wind was colder than usual. The street was quieter. As she walked past the old apartment at the end of Willow Street, she heard it, a faint, uneven cry. It wasn't the kind of cry that babies make when they're hungry or fussy. It was the kind that breaks something inside you when you hear it. She stopped walking. The sound came from behind a half-closed window on the second floor. She looked up and waited, unsure of what to do. The crying grew louder, then softer again, like a wave that kept losing strength. Most people would have kept walking, but she couldn't. Something about that sound held her still. It made her chest tighten and her throat ache. She stood there for a while, looking up, wondering who the baby belonged to and why no one was coming. She told herself maybe the mother was inside, maybe she was busy. But deep down, she didn't believe it. She continued walking, but her mind stayed there, ways with that baby. The sound followed her all the way to the community center. The rest of the day passed like a blur. She helped pack food boxes, cleaned tables, and handed out flyers. But her thoughts kept returning to that apartment window. She kept hearing that tiny cry in her mind. When she lay down in bed that night, she couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she imagined that baby lying alone, waiting for someone to come. The next morning, she decided to walk by the same street again. Part of her told herself she was overreacting, but her heart wouldn't let it go. As she neared the apartment, she slowed down. It was quiet this time. No crying, no sound. The window was still half open. She stood there for a while, staring at it, unsure what to feel. Maybe everything was fine. Maybe she had just worried too much. But just as she turned to leave, she heard it again. That same soft, heartbreaking sound. It was weaker this time, like the baby was running out of strength. Her heart started beating faster. She felt nervous but also determined. She couldn't just walk away again. She crossed the street and stood right under the window. "Hello?" she called out softly, even though she knew the baby couldn't answer. She waited a few seconds, then walked to the building's front door. It was locked, So she pressed the buzzer for the apartment she thought the sound came from. No answer. She pressed it again. Still nothing. She waited, listening carefully. The crying continued. She looked around and saw an older man leaving from another apartment. "Excuse me," she said, "do you know who lives up there?" "I think a baby's crying." The man sighed. "That baby's been crying for months. The mother's not right if you ask me, but it's not our business." Then he walked away, not even looking back. The girl stood there frozen for a moment. Not our business, she didn't agree. It didn't feel right. She didn't know exactly what to do, but she knew she couldn't just go home. She took out her phone and searched for the local authorities' number. Her hands were shaking as she explained what she heard, that there was a baby crying alone, that no one was answering the door. They told her someone would come to check. She thanked them and waited on the sidewalk. Minutes felt like hours. She walked back and forth, looking up at that window, hoping someone would open it, hoping she wasn't too late. Finally, a small van pulled up, and two people stepped out. They introduced themselves gently and thanked her for calling. One of them knocked on the apartment door. No response. They called out, waited, then knocked again, louder this time. The baby's cries grew louder, as if he somehow knew help was near. The rescuers exchanged a look. One of them called for backup, and soon another person arrived with a key. They unlocked the door and stepped inside. The girl waited near the hallway, her heart pounding. She heard them talking quietly. Then she heard a sound that made her eyes fill with tears, and a small, tired whimper turning into a faint cough. A moment later, one of them came out carrying a tiny baby wrapped in a thin blanket. The baby's cheeks were pale, his hair stuck to his forehead. He looked weak but alive. The girl covered her mouth, tears running down her face. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. "Is he okay?" she asked softly. "He will be," one of the rescuers said. "You did the right thing." They took the baby to the van and left for the hospital. The girl stood there long after they were gone, staring at the now empty window. She didn't know what had happened to the mother, but she felt both relief and sadness. That night, she couldn't stop thinking about the baby. She kept wondering if he was safe, if someone was holding him, if he was finally warm and fed. She went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. She kept replaying the moment she saw him, so small, so helpless, and yet still fighting to be heard. In the days that followed, she couldn't focus on anything else. She wanted to know what had happened to him. She went back to the community center and asked one of the coordinators if they knew how to contact child services. They gave her a number and she called. The person on the phone told her the baby was doing better. He was being cared for at the local hospital and would be placed in foster care soon. The girl felt tears fill her eyes again. But this time, they were tears of relief. She thanked the woman on the phone and asked if she could visit the baby. The woman hesitated, then said it might be possible after some paperwork and permissions. The girl agreed to wait. The next few days felt different. The world around her seemed softer, slower. She paid more attention to sounds, the laughter of children, the voices of people talking, the small noises that fill a neighborhood. Everything felt more meaningful now. For the first time, she realized how easy it is for people to ignore pain that isn't theirs. How simple it is to walk past something sad and convince yourself it's not your problem. But she also realized something else, that sometimes, all it takes is one person to listen. She didn't think of herself as a hero. She just couldn't stop caring. When she finally got permission to visit the baby, she went to the hospital with a small stuffed bear she had saved from her childhood. It was old and a bit faded, but she thought it might bring comfort. When she entered the hospital room, she saw the baby lying in a small crib, connected to gentle monitors that beeped softly. His tiny chest rose and fell with each breath. A nurse smiled and said, "He's getting stronger every day." The girl stood beside the crib looking down at him. He opened his eyes, soft, brown, and curious. She smiled through tears and whispered, "You're safe now." The nurse told her the baby had been named temporarily by the hospital staff. He was responding well to care, eating properly, and sleeping longer. The girl stayed there for a while, just watching him sleep. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. Sometimes love doesn't need big words. It just needs presence. When she left the hospital that day, she felt something she hadn't felt before. Peace. Not because everything was suddenly okay, but because she knew one small act of compassion had changed everything for that baby. The city around her looked the same as always. Busy streets, people rushing, lights blinking. But to her, it all felt different now, because she knew what it meant to stop and listen. And she knew that in a world full of people who look away, sometimes being the one who shows up makes all the difference. As she walked past Willow Street again, the window of the old apartment was closed. The building was quiet. She stopped for a moment, remembering that first day when she heard the cry. She looked up at the window and smiled softly. The baby everyone ignored was no longer alone. And deep in her heart, she knew this was only the beginning of their story. The hospital room was quiet except for the steady rhythm of the baby's breathing. He had been there for a few days now, surrounded by white walls, soft blankets, and the gentle hum of machines that kept watch over him. The nurses had grown fond of him already. They spoke to him softly, called him little nicknames, and smiled whenever he opened his eyes. The young girl who had found him visited as often as she could. She wasn't allowed to stay long, but every time she came, she brought warmth with her. Sometimes she brought a small toy or read a story aloud in a soft voice. The baby would listen, blinking slowly as if trying to understand the sound. Every day he looked a little better. His cheeks started to fill out, his skin looked healthier, and his cry, once weak and tired, grew stronger. The nurses said it was a good sign. They told the girl that he was responding well, that babies could recover quickly when they were loved and cared for. But even as things began to get better for him, the story spread quietly through the town. Word got around about the baby from Willow Street. Some people were shocked. Others were ashamed. It made the neighbors uneasy to know that they had all heard him crying and done nothing. The girl's act of kindness had exposed something deeper, how easy it was for people to look away when help was needed. At the community center, people started talking. Some volunteers decided to check on other families in the area. They realized that there were many people struggling silently, single parents, lonely elders, and children who didn't have enough to eat. It was as if the baby's cry had woken something inside the community that had been asleep for too long. One afternoon, the girl sat beside the baby's crib as sunlight filtered through the hospital window. She held his tiny hand and whispered, "You're strong, little one." He moved slightly, gripping her finger. She smiled and felt tears gather in her eyes. She didn't know why she cared so much for a baby she had never met before that week. But she did. Something about him reminded her how important it is to notice, to care, to show up. The doctor entered the room and smiled at her. "He's improving quickly," he said. "He just needed care, warmth, and a little love. That's what saved him." The girl nodded, feeling both happy and sad. She was grateful he was safe now, but her heart still ached for what he had gone through. She couldn't stop wondering about his mother. Where had she gone? What had made her leave? The doctor said they were still trying to find her. The authorities were involved, but no one had been able to locate her yet. The girl listened quietly, her heart heavy. She didn't want to be angry at the mother. She didn't know her story, but she believed that no one truly wanted to abandon their child. Life must have been too heavy, too painful. Days turned into weeks, and the baby continued to grow stronger. The nurses loved to see him smile. The girl noticed how his eyes followed her whenever she walked into the room, as if he recognized her voice. It made her smile every time. One day she brought him a soft blue blanket. "This is yours," she whispered, wrapping it gently around him. "You're safe now. No more cold nights." He cooed softly and reached out his hand as if saying thank you in his own small way. That night, as she left the hospital, she felt something shift inside her. She realized that this experience had changed her too. She had come face to face with what compassion truly meant, not just feeling sorry for someone, but doing something about it. She began volunteering more often, not just at the community center, but also at shelters and hospitals. She wanted to help others who were forgotten, the way that baby had been. Her friends noticed the change in her. She smiled more softly now, listened more carefully, and always seemed to have a quiet determination in her eyes. Meanwhile, the story of the baby continued to spread. Local newspapers wrote small articles about him. People began donating baby supplies to the hospital and to families in need. A local shop even offered to sponsor baby formula for struggling mothers. The community, once silent and closed off, was beginning to open its heart again. The girl didn't seek attention or praise. When people asked her about it, she always said the same thing. Anyone could have done it. I just happened to stop and listen. But everyone knew it wasn't that simple. Stopping and listening takes courage. A few weeks later, social services arranged for the baby to be moved to a foster home. The girl felt both happy and nervous when she heard the news. She wanted him to have a real home, a place full of warmth, laughter, and safety. But she also felt a pang of sadness knowing she wouldn't see him as often. The day before he was to leave the hospital, she visited him one last time there. She sat beside his crib and talked to him as if he could understand every word. "You don't know this yet," she said softly, "but you've changed a lot of hearts. You reminded people to care again. You reminded them that silence isn't kindness." The baby looked up at her, his wide eyes calm and trusting. She smiled and kissed his forehead gently. "I'll come visit you soon, okay?" When she left the hospital, the nurses thanked her. One of them said, "You gave him something no medicine could give, hope." That night, she couldn't stop thinking about what the nurse said. Hope. Such a small word, yet it carried so much meaning. It was the difference between giving up and holding on. In the days that followed, she kept in touch with the social worker. They told her the baby was settling well in his new foster home, being cared for by a kind couple who had always wanted a child. She was relieved. She imagined him wrapped in warm blankets, smiling, learning to laugh again. Meanwhile, in the neighborhood where it all began, things started to look different. The old apartment building was being cleaned up. The residents were kinder to one another. Neighbors began checking in on families, offering help where it was needed. The sound of that baby's cry had been replaced by something else, a sense of awareness. Sometimes, pain has a strange way of teaching people how to love better. Weeks later, the girl received a message from the foster family inviting her to visit. They wanted her to see how well the baby was doing. When she arrived at the small, cozy house, she felt her heart lift. The baby was sitting in a soft chair, giggling as the foster mother made funny faces. His cheeks were full now, his eyes bright. When he saw the girl, he reached out his little arms. She rushed to him, laughing and crying all at once. "Hey there," she whispered, picking him up. "You remember me, don't you?" He smiled, pressing his tiny hands against her face. The foster parents smiled, watching the moment quietly. "He's a happy baby now," the foster mother said. "Thank you for helping him get here." The girl shook her head gently. "It wasn't just me. It was everyone who decided to care." As she held him, she realized something important. The world could be cruel sometimes, yes. People could be selfish, distracted, or afraid. But compassion was still alive, it just needed someone to start it. And that's what she had done. When she left that day, she felt light, peaceful. She looked back one last time at the baby's smile and whispered to herself, "He's going to be okay." On her way home, she passed Willow Street again. The old building stood silent, but it no longer felt heavy. It felt like a closed chapter, a reminder of where change began. Life around her went on. Children played, shopkeepers chatted, cars passed by. The world was noisy again, but in the best way possible. And in the middle of it all, she carried a quiet truth in her heart that sometimes showing up for one small voice can awaken an entire world that had forgotten how to listen. The baby everyone ignored was now a symbol of hope, and the girl who listened had unknowingly started something much bigger than she could have ever imagined. Months passed, and the baby began to grow into a bright, lively little child. The tiny cries that once filled the lonely air had turned into laughter that warmed every room. The foster parents cared for him with so much love that anyone who saw them together could feel it. The house, small and humble, was always full of soft music, sunlight, and warmth. The girl continued to visit often. She didn't go out of obligation. She went because her heart wanted to. Every time she walked up to the door and heard the sound of his laughter, she felt a sense of peace that words couldn't describe. When she first stepped inside after a few weeks away, she couldn't believe how much he had changed. His cheeks were round, his hair thicker, and his eyes full of life. He was learning to crawl and would laugh whenever someone clapped for him. The foster mother smiled and said, "He's growing fast. He's curious about everything." The girl sat on the floor beside him, handing him a small toy. He grabbed it clumsily, shaking it with delight. The sound of the rattle made him giggle. She couldn't help but laugh too. "You're such a strong little one," she said softly, brushing his hair from his forehead. It amazed her how much love could change a person. even one so small. The baby who had once been left in silence now lived surrounded by voices that cared, hands that comforted, and hearts that listened. The foster father joined them and said, "He loves music. Every time we play a song, he smiles." So they played a soft tune on the radio, and the baby clapped his hands trying to follow the rhythm. It was a small, beautiful moment, one that felt like sunlight after a long storm. As the months went by, the girl noticed something else changing. Not just the baby, but the people around him. The community had grown closer since his story spread. People had started checking on each other more often, offering help instead of silence. The grocery store owner now kept a small donation box for struggling families. The community center had started a weekly support meeting for parents. Neighbors greeted one another with warmth, not distance. The baby's story had touched something deep in everyone's heart. It reminded them how fragile life can be, and how important it is to care before it's too late. One day, the girl was invited to a small event at the community center. It was a gathering to thank volunteers and neighbors who had stepped forward to help others after the incident. She didn't expect to be mentioned, but when the organizer called her name, the entire room clapped. She felt shy and emotional as she walked to the front. She didn't know what to say at first. Then after a moment of silence, she said quietly, "I just listened to a sound that others ignored. I think sometimes the world doesn't need big heroes. It just needs people who stop and care." The crowd went silent for a moment, then the applause grew louder. Some had tears in their eyes. After the event, many people came up to her sharing their own stories. One mother said she had been struggling alone, but found comfort in knowing that kindness still existed. An elderly man said he had decided to volunteer again after years of isolation. That night, the girl walked home with a full heart. She thought about how one simple act had grown into something far greater than she ever imagined. At the foster home, the baby continued to thrive. He learned to stand on his own, took his first wobbly steps, and spoke his first word. The foster parents sent photos to the girl, and every time she saw them, she smiled. In one picture, he was sitting in the grass, holding a flower in his small hand. In another, he was laughing, his teeth just starting to show. The girl printed those photos and kept them in a small notebook. She sometimes looked through them on quiet nights, reminding herself that hope always finds a way. As time went on, she began studying childcare and social work. She wanted to help others like him, those whose cries went unheard. She said it wasn't a career choice, but a calling. She wanted to be the kind of person who showed up when no one else did. She spent her weekends helping at the community center, teaching younger kids how to show kindness. She would tell them, "You never know whose life you can change just by caring a little more." Meanwhile, the baby, now a toddler, became known as the little miracle of the town. People who once ignored the sound of his cry now smiled every time they saw him. Shopkeepers waved, children played with him in the park, and even strangers offered small gifts. He had become a living reminder of compassion. One sunny afternoon, the girl joined the foster family at the park. The toddler was running across the grass, chasing bubbles that floated in the air. He laughed so hard that his giggles echoed through the park. The sound made her heart swell with joy. The foster mother turned to her and said softly, "He's changed our lives completely. Our home feels fuller, happier. It's like he brought light with him." The girl smiled. "He's special. He always was." As they watched him play, she thought back to that first day, standing on that cold street, hearing his cry through a window. She had no idea that moment would lead here, to sunshine, laughter, and a little boy who was loved beyond measure. When the toddler fell and scraped his knee, he didn't cry much. The foster father picked him up gently, brushed the dirt away, and kissed his forehead. The little boy clung to him for a moment, then smiled again. It was such a small thing, but to the girl it meant everything. This child now knew comfort. He knew love. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low, the girl walked home with a peaceful heart. The world felt softer somehow, more connected. But she couldn't help thinking about all the other willow streets out there. Other babies, other cries, other people waiting for someone to notice. She promised herself she would never stop listening. A few weeks later, the community center started a campaign called The Sound of Care. It encouraged people to look out for one another, to speak up, to act with kindness, to never ignore someone in need. The girl helped design the posters. She added a small line at the bottom that said, "One voice can change everything." The campaign spread quickly. Schools joined in. Shops displayed posters. Even nearby towns took notice. And through it all, the little boy kept growing, surrounded by more love than he could ever understand. On his second birthday, the foster family held a small celebration at the park. The girl was there, of course. There were balloons, laughter, and a small cake with 2 candles. When everyone sang happy birthday, the boy clapped his hands and tried to sing along. The girl watched him, tears glimmering in her eyes. She thought of the lonely nights when his cries went unheard, and how far he had come since then. After the candles were blown out, the foster mother handed the boy a gift, a framed photo of the girl holding him during his hospital days. "So he'll always know who listened," she said softly. The girl smiled, speechless. She knelt beside the boy and whispered, "You're loved more than you'll ever know." As the sun set that evening, the light touched everything, the trees, the faces, the laughter, wrapping the moment in quiet beauty. The girl looked at the boy running in the grass and realized something deep and simple. Sometimes, the smallest act of courage can grow into something endless. The baby everyone ignored was no longer a symbol of sorrow. He was a symbol of hope, and the girl who listened had shown an entire town what it means to truly care. Years went by, and time quietly carried the story forward. The baby everyone once ignored was now a bright, curious child with a smile that could light up any room. His laughter was louder than his first cries had ever been, and his heart was full of love instead of loneliness. The little boy grew up in a home where kindness was not just spoken but shown every day. The foster parents who had once taken him in loved him as their own. They taught him how to walk, how to read, and how to find joy in small things. The girl who had saved him continued to visit as often as she could. Their bond never faded. If anything, it grew stronger with every passing year. She watched him take his first steps, say his first words, and start school for the first time. She was there for birthdays, for holidays, for quiet afternoons in the park. She had become part of his story in a way that neither of them fully understood, but both of them felt deeply. The boy, now full of energy and endless curiosity, loved to ask questions. One day, while they sat on a bench watching the sunset, he looked up at her and asked, "Why do you always come to see me?" She smiled, thinking about how to answer. "Because you remind me that kindness matters," she said softly. "You remind me what love can do." He didn't quite understand, but he smiled anyway and leaned against her shoulder. That was enough. The years continued to move forward as they always do. The town had changed too. Willow Street was no longer quiet and forgotten. The old apartment building had been repainted, the garden out front now filled with flowers planted by volunteers. What was once a place of silence had become a place of life. The community that once ignored a baby's cry had grown into a family of caring people. Neighbors helped each other. The community center thrived. The Sound of Care campaign had become a yearly event, reminding everyone to notice the voices that go unheard. The girl, now older, had turned her compassion into her life's work. She became a social worker, visiting homes, listening to children, helping families who struggled. Every time she looked into the eyes of a child who needed help, she thought of that little baby from long ago, and she listened. The boy continued to grow. He was full of questions about the world and loved learning new things. He had a gentle heart, always the first to share his lunch at school or comfort a friend who was sad. The teachers often said he had a rare kind of kindness for someone his age. When people asked his foster parents how they raised such a thoughtful child, they always said, "He was born with a brave heart." The girl, who had once been a teenager hearing a cry through a window, now saw in him the future she hoped for. Every time she saw him smile, she was reminded that one act of courage can ripple through years and change lives far beyond what anyone can imagine. One afternoon, many years later, the boy, now almost grown, sat with her at the same park where he had played as a toddler. The air was filled with the sound of laughter and birds. The world felt calm. He turned to her and asked, "Can I ask you something?" She nodded, smiling. "Did you really save me?" he asked softly. She looked at him for a long moment, her heart full. "I don't know if I saved you," she said, "but I heard you when no one else did. Maybe that was enough. He was quiet for a while, thinking about her words. "I think you did save me," he finally said. "Because if you hadn't listened, I wouldn't be here." She felt her eyes fill with tears, but they were happy tears, the kind that come when your heart feels too full for words. She reached over and squeezed his hand. "Then maybe," she said, "we saved each other." They sat there in silence, watching the sun dip lower. It painted the sky in soft gold and pink. As time went on, the boy became a young man. He wanted to give back just like she had. He started volunteering at the same community center where she once worked. He helped with food drives, read to younger kids, and told others that every act of kindness matters, and no matter how small. He didn't talk much about his past. But when people asked why he cared so deeply, he always said, "Because someone once cared for me when no one else did." That simple sentence touched everyone who heard it. The girl, now a woman, often watched him with quiet pride. He had grown into everything she had hoped he would: kind, thoughtful, brave. He was living proof that love can rewrite even the saddest stories. Sometimes when she looked at him, she could still see the tiny baby who had once cried alone in that old apartment. But now he was surrounded by light, the kind that comes from being loved and loving others in return. The town continued to thrive. Every year, on the anniversary of the day he was rescued, the community gathered for a small celebration. They didn't call it a holiday. They called it the Day of Listening. It was a reminder that everyone has a voice worth hearing, and everyone deserves to be seen. The young man always attended, standing quietly beside the woman who had changed his life. People would smile at them, knowing their story. They had become symbols of compassion, proof that one simple moment of courage can last a lifetime. During one of these gatherings, the young man stepped forward to speak for the first time. The crowd grew silent as he took the microphone. He looked around at the faces, neighbors, children, families, and smiled. "I was once a baby that everyone ignored," he began. "But one person stopped and listened. Because of that, I got a chance to grow up, to laugh, to love, to be here today. I think that's what this day means, that no one's voice should ever be too small to be heard." The audience clapped softly, some wiping tears from their eyes. The woman stood nearby, her heart swelling with pride. When the speech ended, the young man walked over to her and hugged her. "You changed my world," he whispered. She smiled and whispered back, "You changed mine too." As the evening came to a close, the crowd lit small candles, holding them up to the sky. The light shimmered across the park, warm and gentle. It was quiet for a few moments, not the kind of silence that comes from ignoring, but the kind that feels full of peace. The woman looked at the glowing lights and thought about how everything had begun. One lonely cry on a cold night, one choice to stop and listen. That simple act had created ripples that reached far beyond what she could have imagined. She realized that love doesn't always start with grand gestures. Sometimes it starts with a pause, a moment when someone decides to care. The young man stood beside her, holding his candle. Together they looked out over the sea of light. "I used to think my story began with sadness," he said softly, "but now I think it began with hope." She nodded. "Hope always finds a way," she said. They stood there quietly, side by side, as the candles flickered and the night sky stretched above them. Around them, laughter and soft voices filled the air. The world felt kind again, and in that gentle glow, their story came full circle, not as a story of pain, but as one of compassion, courage, and second chances. The baby everyone ignored had become a man who listened. And the girl, who once stopped on a lonely street, had become the reminder that love, even in its way, smallest form, can heal the world. Years moved quietly, the way sunlight slowly shifts across the floor. The young man grew older, and so did the woman who had once stopped on that lonely street to listen. Seasons came and went, but their bond never faded. It was no longer just about the past. It was about what they built from it. The woman had turned her small acts of kindness into a lifelong mission. She had helped so many children over the years, some in shelters, some in hospitals, some simply in need of a kind voice. People in town often said she had a heart that could hear what others couldn't. The young man admired her deeply. He often visited her after work, sitting with her in the garden behind her home. It was a quiet place filled with flowers she had planted over the years, sunflowers, daisies, and a single small willow tree. "This garden feels alive," he once told her. She smiled. "Because everything here grew from love," she said softly. He nodded. "Just like me." They both laughed, but there was truth in his words. He had indeed grown from love, the kind that started as a whisper and became a legacy. Now an adult, he worked as a teacher at the local school. Children loved him. He listened to them in ways few adults did, not just to their words but to their silences. He made sure every child felt seen, every voice felt heard. Sometimes when a student looked sad or withdrawn, he would quietly sit beside them and say, "I'm listening." It was simple, but it worked. The children opened up because they could feel his sincerity. He never told them the full story of his own past. But in his heart he knew that every time he showed kindness, he was passing forward the care he once received. One day after school, he was walking home when he saw a small boy sitting on the curb, holding a broken toy and crying softly. People walked by, busy with their day, not noticing. For a moment he just watched, feeling something stir deep inside him. A memory, faint but powerful. Then he walked over, knelt down, and said gently, "Hey, what's wrong?" The boy looked up, tears shining on his cheeks. "My car's broken," he said. "It was my favorite." The young man smiled softly. "Let me see." He took the toy, fixed the loose wheel with a small twist, and handed it back. "There," he said. "Good as new." The boy's face lit up instantly. "Thank you," he said, hugging his toy tightly. The young man smiled. "You're welcome. Remember, sometimes things break, but that doesn't mean they're gone forever." The boy nodded, then ran off smiling again. As the young man stood up, he felt a rush of warmth in his chest. The same warmth that girl once felt on that cold night when she stopped to listen. It was the same act, just in a different time, a different way. He realized the story was still alive, not in words, but in moments like that. Later that evening, he went to visit the woman. She was sitting on her porch, wrapped in a light blanket, a gentle smile on her face as she watched the sunset. "You're quiet today," she said, as he sat beside her. He nodded. "I saw a boy crying on the street today," he said. "I stopped and helped him." Her smile deepened, soft and knowing. "That's good," she said. "You listened." He looked at her, realizing that what she had given him years ago wasn't just a second chance at life. It was the ability to carry compassion forward. They sat there together, watching the light fade. The world seemed calm and full at that moment. As the years passed, the woman's health began to slow her down. She moved gently now, her hair silver, her hands thinner but still strong. Yet her spirit never dimmed. She continued to visit the community center whenever she could, still guiding younger volunteers, still listening to the quiet voices that others missed. One day, the young man helped her plant new flowers in the garden. She looked tired but happy. "You know," she said softly, her hands resting in the soil, "I used to wonder why I heard that cry that night. Out of all the noise in the world, why that one sound?" He looked at her, waiting. "I think it was meant to reach me," she said, "because I needed to learn what love really is, not something we say, but something we do." He felt a lump in his throat. "You taught me that," he whispered. She smiled and touched his hand gently. "Then my life has been worth everything." The wind moved softly through the garden. The small willow tree swayed, its leaves whispering in the breeze. That night he sat outside long after she had gone to rest, looking up at the stars. He thought about how her one small act had changed everything, not just for him, but for everyone who had learned from her. Weeks later, the woman peacefully passed away in her sleep. The whole town felt the loss deeply. The community center held a gathering in her memory. People came from all over, families she had helped, children she had cared for, neighbors whose lives she had touched. The young man stood at the front, speaking to the crowd with a calm voice. "She once told me," he began, "that love is not something we say, it's something we do. She proved that every day of her life. Because of her, I'm here. Because of her, so many of us are who we are today." The audience was silent, many wiping away tears. He continued, "She taught us that listening, really listening, can change everything. So tonight I don't want us to be sad. I want us to listen. To the wind, to each other, to life itself. That's how we keep her spirit alive." Then, as he finished speaking, he took a small candle and placed it under the willow tree she had planted. Soon others did the same. The whole garden glowed with gentle light. The young man looked up at the stars and whispered, "Thank you for hearing me when no one else did." Years later, the garden became a quiet sanctuary. People came there to think, to heal, to remember. A small sign stood near the entrance. It read, "This is where love first listened." Children often came to visit during school trips. The young man, now older, would tell them the story, not in a grand or dramatic way, but simply. "There was once a baby everyone ignored," he would begin. "But one person stopped to listen. That's how everything changed." The children always listened with wide eyes. At the end, they would ask, "Is the story true?" And he would smile softly and say, "Yes, and it still is." Because by then the story had become more than memory. It was a way of life for the town. People helped each other without hesitation. No one was ever left unseen or unheard again. The small act that began with a single cry had turned into a legacy that would never fade. And as the young man, now a teacher, a mentor and a listener, watched the children run around the garden, he felt a quiet joy. The story had come full circle again. Somewhere in the soft wind, it almost felt as though he could still hear her voice. Gentle, kind, and full of warmth when whispering, "Keep listening." He closed his eyes, smiled, and whispered back, "I will." And in that promise, her love lived on, through him, through the children, through everyone who understood that the smallest act of care can echo through generations. The baby everyone ignored had become the man who listened, and the girl who once heard a cry in the dark had become a light that never went out.